excited to be part of the 2023 Graduate Student Colloquium. I am currently a student in the Master's of Arts in Criminal Justice, or the MAT-J program. I'm going to be talking about a policy paper presentation I did in my CRIM 601 course, Criminal Justice Policy and Practice. The topic of my presentation is about compassionate release in Indiana. So the concept of compassionate release is a hotly debated topic in the United States and really around the world. Though the term of compassionate release varies, essentially the concept revolves around allowing for some sort of release for terminally ill, mentally ill, and elderly inmates from the prison setting into the community in some way, to allow them to live out their days outside of the prison walls. In doing so, there's an alleviation of crowding in the prison, potential reduction in the cost of housing someone in a high need category, and the potential to allow someone a more quality end of life event. Currently, all but 4 states have some variation of compassionate release, and there are also federal guidelines regarding this topic. The federal guidelines are pretty clear on minimum age, medical guidelines that must be met, and minimum time served for release eligibility. These guidelines only apply to the federally run institutions, though, and do not extend to state-run facilities. The result of the states having their own guidelines is a mixed variety of somewhat hazy policies and can be very confusing to inmates. There's also a barrier in communication with these options, and often a long process to apply, with long waits at times, depending on how release is granted in each state. Some inmates who may otherwise qualify for release in a state may not even be aware of the option to do so. As of 2020, only Alabama and New Mexico require disclosure of the process. So there are a lot of barriers involved in many instances, leaving quality inmates to remain incarcerated for longer periods of time, or even dying before they can be released. Compassionate release is a concept that has risen out of a concern for the cost of treating higher need inmates, along with issue of overcrowding in facilities. The cost of advanced health care can be a concern in prisons. When someone is imprisoned, assistance programs such as Medicare are taken away in most cases. With the onset of the First Steps Act, there are some instances in which inmates have been allowed to retain their assistance, but in most cases this has not been the case due to issues with the way in which someone qualifies to remain in the program. As a result, the cost of advanced health care goes to the prison system. Availability of treatment is an issue as well. Facilities vary greatly in the types and levels of treatment available. So some who are in a facility that's not equipped to handle their scope of needs do not receive adequate health care. Another issue is that facilities are not properly equipped to handle the needs of the elderly or incapacitated. Many facilities have not had updates in several years, and they lack the necessary upgrades to handle the needs of those who are physically handicapped, who may be fall risks, or those with dementia who may just wander around. So just to name a few examples. Upgrading facilities to handle wheelchairs, lower bedding, handicap accessible bathrooms can be very costly and not always feasible. Handling individuals and their needs is not always feasible with overcrowding as well. For example, with this topic in mind, if you have someone who's suffering from Alzheimer's, they may be in a situation where they would be better served, or it would be safer for them to be in a private location or in a secured area. but they could be forced in the general population instead, which exposes them to the potential for abuse and injury. Communication is an issue. Offenders who may be eligible or approaching eligible to be released in this way may not be informed of that option. They may not know what avenues they have and what they need to do in order to initiate the process. Those with severe illnesses may perhaps not know they have the option, or if they do, they may not have someone to assist them through the process on their behalf. In most cases that I saw, most states do not initiate this process for someone. It is something the offender must initiate on their own. On top of that, most states have a very slow process for review. For states that require the application to go through the parole board, that can take some time. It can be pretty far down on their agenda. So it takes a lot of time for that to be reviewed. If you are someone with a terminal illness, it could make the difference between living the remainder of your days outside of prison or dying inside of prison in your cell. So currently, the state of Indiana does not have a compassionate release policy. We do have something called medical clemency. There are issues with this type of policy. So first, medical clemency does not address any non-critical age-related issues. So you cannot be considered for release simply based on age or other factors outside of a critical illness. Second, there are pretty strict requirements for medical release consideration in Indiana. The offender has to have a terminal illness for which there's no treatment available at the location where they are incarcerated. So if they are approved based on that, the offender actually must be released straight to a nursing facility or a hospital to live out the remainder of their days. So obviously, medical clemency encompasses a pretty narrow set of offenders. Finally, the process for medical clemency is quite lengthy because the governor is actually the only one that can grant medical clemency in Indiana. So that can result in a long wait and inmates actually passing away before clemency is granted. So my proposal for changing or creating a policy for compassionate release in Indiana is as follows. First, I would establish an age minimum. Generally, the line for being considered elderly in prisons is age 50 to 55. Without getting into too many details as to why the age seems vastly different than the general population, there are several factors that create a more rapid aging process in the prison system. That does not mean that the minimum age for compassionate release needs to be 50, but it's just something to consider as the age is determined. Anyone under that age could still utilize medical clemency for those terminal illness situations. Second, I would establish some clear guidelines on who qualifies and how. What will the process be for those applying and for granting compassionate release? There would need to be guidelines established, and they need to be clear as to who qualifies and who does not. Are there certain offenses that would exclude the ability to apply, like, let's say, first-degree murder or sex offenses? Does an offender have to serve a certain portion of their sentence before they can apply? Are there special requirements for someone who is granted release, such as lifetime monitoring or specific living arrangements that are required? So there are many things to consider when creating the policy that would need to be addressed. Third, all inmates should receive options in a clear format, both written and verbal, with evidence of receipt and understanding. There is no reason that something like this should be hidden. This should really extend to any sort of policy or program within a facility or a system, not just compassionate release. Offenders should always have the ability to understand their options. So fourth, risk assessments and disciplinary records should be taken into account, but not the sole decision factor when deciding on release for an offender. Some states use these tools as an elimination factor in determining whether to grant release or not. I think these records should be carefully looked at for situational issues. For example, when dealing with compassionate release, if you have an elderly inmate with dementia, it could be quite possible for them to have been written up for being aggressive towards a guard, but in reality, they were simply confused and lashing out in that moment, not really creating a dangerous situation at all. So I think those records should be reviewed carefully to determine if they really are a risk at this point in their life or not. Fifth, compassionate release should not be the decision of the governor alone, like medical clemency is, but should be reviewed by a parole board. This can help remove political bias and also takes the decision-making out of the hands of just one person. Lastly, one very important part of the proposal is creating a post-release plan for those who are granted compassionate release. This is a critical part of the process and provides for the security of the individual leaving and also the community. There are things an offender will need assistance with, such as reinitiating Medicare and other government programs, finding safe locations, and connecting them with appropriate medical services. So they will have some quality of life. Granting someone compassionate release, but then leaving them to figure things out on their own, it's not a humane way to run the program, and they'd at that point be better off staying inside the facility than being released. So to wrap up, there are a few important benefits to compassionate release. This type of policy would allow select elderly inmates the opportunity to live their final days outside the prison walls. It would save prisons the high costs of medical care and take some pressure off of finding a way to upgrade facilities to accommodate all of the special needs involved with caring for such a special population. Indiana creating, if they were to create a robust compassionate release policy, that would, create a streamlined system that other states could look at and use for best practices. It could also help reduce overcrowding in the prison system in Indiana by providing an alternative path to community release. While compassionate release certainly would be limited in the scope of who qualifies, the prison populations are aging quickly and overcrowding is a major issue. With the graying of the prison population, states need to create ways to aid in solutions to the problem. Providing a way for those who are growing old and suffering ailments and terminal illnesses in prison to be released is a solution that benefits the system as well as the offender. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you gained some insight into my topic, as well as the MAGJ program overall and what it has to offer students in their learning pathway.